It's St. Patrick's Day. I know most people celebrate by going out and drinking, going to parades, and that kind of stuff. What I'd like to do for the holiday is share some stories of one of the oldest Irish legends and one of my favorite spirits, the Banshee. The spirit whose scream foreshadows the death of someone close to you. Before we get started, make sure you give this video a like and share it with anyone who may be interested. But for now, let's get started with true chilling Banshee encounters. All of my life I've been a little sensitive, feeling vibes in certain rooms, getting that gut feeling about something, and I have deja vu occur a lot. Just a lot of different experiences like that. One thing that I remember very clearly as a child is hearing my name as clear as day, usually followed by me asking my mom why she was calling me since the voice sounded female, only to have her tell me that she never called for me. But the other day my dad asked me a weird question. He asked if I still had the dreams like I used to have, and I asked him what he meant. Apparently when I was younger, I constantly had dreams about my past relatives, most of whom I had never even met. I was even able to send along messages from my grandparents to my parents, for instance, and give pieces of information about them that no one had ever told me about. My father then also told me that for a short while, he would hear me in my room talking to someone, and when he walked in and asked who I was talking to, I would say Grandma, like it was completely normal. I don't know why I don't remember any of this, except for little bits and pieces. But I think it's because my mother in particular doesn't enjoy that type of talk and had to try to refrain me from it. My father seemed to be more supportive, him believing in these kind of things, and he was interested if I had had any more of those dreams to see if I had any new messages. What this all boils down to is I've been wondering if it's possible for my family to have some type of spiritual abilities. It goes down as far as my great-grandmother on my mother's side. My mom finally told me about her horrifying account of a banshee and other things that happened to her throughout her life, which is probably why she wasn't happy when her child started to experience the same thing. Every woman in my family has experienced the cry of the banshee. Apparently, there is an awful howling that radiates the entire house and even outside that is so loud and terrifying it makes you want to flee. It's supposed to be the banshee howling over someone's soon-to-be demise from what she told me. My great-grandmother, grandmother, and mother all experienced it at some point in their life. When my mother experienced hers, she was home alone at the time, and she said it was almost like a horrible wolf howling, and it was so loud that any room you went into it seemed to follow you. She told me how she went through the house, the basement, and even outside to try to find where it was coming from. And after an hour or so, right before my grandmother came home, it stopped. My mom waited outside for her terrified and explained to her what happened. My grandmother was very calm about the whole situation and explained to her that our family is cursed by the banshee. A few days later, my great-grandmother died. Another thing that happened to her was kind of an omen. A few days before my grandfather died, my grandmother and mother were in the kitchen, and my mom happened to look outside the window and saw the entire yard filled with crows. From what she told me, there wasn't an inch of the yard that wasn't covered by the birds, and this was in late December. A day or so later, right before Christmas, my grandfather died of a sudden heart attack. I haven't yet heard this cry or seen any omens like this, but I've had a lot of things happen in my life. Not too long ago, I was at a friend's house. I walked out into the hallway and seen a bird just sitting on the crown molding on the top floor hallway. Of course, I went to go investigate, calling my friend to come get it out of the house, and we both saw it fly into the room we use for storage. It went behind an old dresser we don't use, and I went to get it out so that we could get it back outside, and it had vanished. There was no trace whatsoever of the bird. I even turned to my friend to see if it had possibly flew out of the room or anything, and he was as stunned as I was. Then after we proceeded to go through the house, none of the doors or windows in the house were open. It was winter, so windows being open would have been a bit ridiculous. We went downstairs and asked if anyone had seen the bird or anything because it was a little odd, and it was only on the second floor and no one had seen anything, and a bird would be kind of hard to miss. The thing is, when I seen it, it was like I was compelled to look where it was. I mean, how often do I exit the bedroom and look up across at the crown molding? Never. The only thing I can match this to is when I was going through a rather difficult time in my life and took it either as a sign for things to get better or things to get worse, given my family's previous history with birds. I haven't had a dream of someone contacting me since my grandmother passed. It was the most comforting thing I remember at that time. She came to me the day she died and told me not to cry for her, that she was in a better place and doesn't want me being upset. When I finally told my mom about this a few years later, she told me that while she was still grieving and was alone in the house, she heard my grandmother's voice call her name, as clear as a bell. My mom took it as a sign of her trying to comfort her. I'm still trying to figure out if it's possible for the women on my mother's side of the family to be sensitive to something or possibly have something following us. I should mention her side is solely of Irish descent. This is a story my dad told me, of his first-hand experience. My dad was 18 or 19 at the time, and with two other friends, they drove to some pub in a rural town. One friend, we'll call Bert, said he didn't feel too good tonight. I'm just gonna stay in the car for a bit. So my dad and his other friend went into the pub around 9. After getting drunk and forgetting about him being left in a car, they went out about 11 p.m. to check on him. He looked in and Bert was in the middle of the back seat, and he was previously in the front seat. He was sitting bolt up straight, tears streaming down his face in a trance. My dad tried to open the door, but it was locked. He tried to snap him out of the trance, saying firmly, "Bert, unlock the door." He opened the door, and immediately Bert was asking if he had heard that. My dad asked him what he was talking about, and Bert quickly replied to take him home. Not breaking his stare out of the front windshield, they drove him home, Bert not saying a word. My dad continued to ask what happened, but he wouldn't reply, and he didn't want to stress him out. So he just dropped him home, and Bert just left without saying a word. The next day, another friend asked Bert why he was so freaked out last night. He told him a black shadowy figure of a woman stood in front of the car and came flying up to the windshield face to face with him, giving him a deathly scream. With an open mouth so large it was inhuman. It had an empty blackness for eyes and just stared at him. Then it flew off. He moved to the back seat to feel less exposed. Bert found out that his uncle was pronounced dead around 11 p.m. that night. My sister died this morning. A heart attack. She was 23 years old. Normally, this kind of thing is extremely upsetting. This is mostly due to the suddenness of a person leaving you behind. One day they're here, in this world, and the next they're gone. For me, it wasn't that upsetting. I knew she was going to die. What is really disturbing is what happened the night before. It was late, probably about 2 in the morning, and I was driving home from work. Work's been really busy lately, and I didn't get off until about 1. On the way home, I generally take the back highway, It's a pretty straight road, and the cops never patrol that route, so I can usually do about 20 over the speed limit. The road itself, I would say, is creepy. Dead trees span the entire roadway, and there's no street or traffic lights in any form, except for the moon. For the most part, the road is covered in a foggy mist due to the presence of a swamp about 500 meters from the road. I've traveled this road hundreds of times at this time, and I've never seen anyone on it. Until last night. I was about halfway through the drive home when I seen a woman standing on the side of the road. Concerned, I pulled over and got out of my car as I approached the woman. I saw she had long gray and frayed hair that touched the small of her back. She was wearing a black dress that was dirty and tattered at the bottom. As I got closer, I called out to the woman but got no response. As I got even closer, I called out again. And this is when the woman slowly started to turn around. And when she turned around completely, my stomach dropped. The woman's face appeared haggard and dirty. Scars and moles, discoloration filled her pale white face. Her eyes were blacker than the night that surrounded her, and she just gazed at me. Her lips were dry and filled with cracks, and a little bit of dried blood, but it formed a smile. I stammered backwards as the woman took a step forward, the stench of her wet clothing finally reaching my nose. The stench of a long decomposing body. The frame of her body was small and frail, and the dress she was wearing was covered in what appeared to be fresh blood. She stood there for several seconds, before lifting her bony hand and pointing a finger at me. She gave off a blood-curdling scream that felt like it shattered my eardrums. The scream continued for about 10 seconds. Then she stopped, muttered something under her breath, and began to walk off the highway and into the swamp. I didn't follow her. I got into my car and took off as fast as I could. I knew who she was and why she was there. I had seen her before. I first saw her when I was 6. I remember waking up late in the middle of the night to a tapping on the window. I opened my blinds to see the very same woman, not a day older or younger, staring at me from outside. She stared at me for several seconds before mimicking the same wail she used the night before, and then vanished. The next morning, my father died in a car accident. I saw her again when I was 14, walking home. I saw her from across the road, same dress, same smell, same eyes, and once again, that horrible sound. The next morning, my uncle hung himself in our garage. At 19, she appeared again with the same routine, and you can probably guess what happened next. I spent a couple years researching this woman, who she was, why she was following me, and what she wanted. Finally, I figured out the answer. She was a Banshee. Her purpose was simple. Her presence accompanied with her blood-curdling screams. It's all a message. Someone close to you has or is going to die. You can't stop it. The fate of the doomed person is already sealed upon the cry of the Banshee. Banshees are usually attached to families, and specifically to one individual person per generation. They're apparently physically harmless, or so I've been told, but I don't believe this to be true. When I seen her most recently, when she muttered something after her scream, I knew what she said. I've been deaf in one ear almost all of my life, and I've learned to read lips. I knew what she said. She told me that I was next. In Irish mythology, a banshee is a female spirit, a messenger of death. She begins to wail if someone is about to die. She's not even always seen in person, but everyone will know it's her. Her wail is painfully sad, and she can appear as an ugly old hag or the most stunningly beautiful woman you've ever seen. To some people, it may sound stupid and fake, I know, but I've seen her. It was a normal afternoon. I was taking my chocolate lab for a walk. We walked no longer than 5 minutes until she started flipping out, barking and howling at trees. And she's never done anything like this before. I was gonna start walking back, and that's when I seen her. Right in front of me. Staring. She was wearing a beautiful white dress with a veil on her head, covering her face. I started to ask her if she was alright, but she cut me off in the middle of my sentence with the most horrible scream that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. It was like she was in pure agony. It felt like my eardrums were going to burst. My dog cried, howled, and barked, and then the scream stopped. I opened my eyes and she was gone. Thank God. I was completely freaked out but couldn't even speak. All that came out of me was a faint whisper. My poor dog was whimpering and hiding in the corner by some shrubs. I took her home and gave her a bath. A nice bath always calms her down. It seemed to have worked. She went to bed immediately afterwards. I decided to take a bath too. A nice hot bubble bath, and it worked wonders on me. I felt relaxed and calm, but then I went to sleep. But I had the most terrifying dream I may have ever experienced. I was in the forest alone, and there in the distance was an old log cabin. So of course I ran to it, opened the door and went inside. And that woman was there, screaming and covered in blood. It was coming out of her mouth. Buckets full of black blood. I woke up in a cold sweat, and that's when I got a phone call telling me my dad died from a heart attack. It was my mother sobbing on the phone who called. I broke down. My dad had been my best friend. The funeral was even worse. My family wouldn't stop crying. My mother was a wreck, and then they buried him. My mother and I cried all night and prayed all day. That horrible third day is when I seen the woman again, looking through my bedroom window crying. Then she walked off, and I haven't seen her since. When I was 7 years old, we lived in a place called Dundrum County, down in Ireland. I had never experienced anything ghostly, though at age 7 I was afraid of just about everything. One night, I was laying in my bed trying to fall asleep. I was laying on my back with my arms folded across my chest and the blanket up to my chin. The bed faced a small window in what we call the box room. It was around 8 foot by 6 foot. As I was trying to fall asleep, I felt a gust. I opened my eyes in time to see the curtains falling back into place, so I got up from my bed to close the window. When I got to it, I took a step back, thinking how strange it was that the window was closed. So I laid back in bed, occasionally peeking at the curtains. When nothing had happened for a while, I felt comfortable enough to keep my eyes closed. To my horror, I felt a huge gush. The curtains were nearly touching the ceiling. I lay there frozen, and I swear I wish this was a lie, but the ugliest and most tatty-dressed in white woman swept through the glass and hovered a couple feet above my bed staring at me. I tried to get up to run to my parents' room, but the ugly old woman was tightening the cover around my neck. I struggled with all of my might, with my eyes closed when somehow I managed to break free, and I bolted down the hall and freaked out, waking my parents. My father was a very strict man. He told me to grow up and marched me back to my room. I sat upright in the bed the rest of the night with the blanket over my head, sitting in a puddle of my own piss. I thought if I could just remain silent, maybe the old woman wouldn't hear me and wouldn't bother me anymore. I'm now 38, and I still can't sleep with my bed facing a window. My wife knows why, as there's nothing I have not confided in her. Over the years, I've heard of a connection known as old hag syndrome. Even if that is what it was no less terrifying to a 7-year-old. A few days after that horrific experience, though, my parents had a bad car crash. An oncoming speeding car hit black ice on a country road. My parents survived the collision, but my father was in hospital for weeks. I wonder if it was an omen and the Banshee had sent a warning. I feel myself returning to that petrified 7-year-old and consoling him in my mind. Surely, she won't return. My parents came to New York from Ireland in the 1950s. They were very strict Catholics and did not speak about supernatural things very much. But every Thanksgiving, we would sit around the table and they would tell us ghost stories. One of the stories they would tell was about the Banshee. The Banshee is an Irish spirit that foretells the death of a family member by wailing and crying outside the family home. She cries for certain Irish members, the very old Irish families, the O'Neills, the O'Briens, O'Connors, and the Kavanaghs. Supposedly, there are only 6 or 8 families like this. Years had passed and I was in my bedroom, cleaning out my drawers of my dresser. I was standing next to my bedroom window. We lived in an apartment that was on the 5th floor, and the window faced out into an alleyway. It was dusk when the crying started. First, it sounded like a newborn or a cat crying. Now, I knew my neighbors and didn't know of anyone that had a newborn, but it was an alleyway, and so I thought it was probably a cat. But the crying changed into that of a young child crying or sobbing, and it was the saddest cry I have ever heard. I tried to lift up my window to call out to the person crying. I thought it was Tommy Kavanaugh next door. I yelled out because I couldn't see anything. There was no light and it was very dark outside. There was no answer, just crying. I yelled out asking Tommy, "Is that you? Are you okay? Do you need any help?" No answer, just more crying. The throbbing changed again into a woman's sobs. Again, heartbreak-sounding sobs, coming from an unknown source. My mom came into the room and the crying stopped. I asked her if she heard the crying. "It sounds like someone is really hurt." She said she didn't hear anything. She was in the living room and the apartment was not that big. She should have heard the crying. She looked at me very funny and shook her head. When she left the room, it started up again. This was not a crying that was from somebody being physically hurt. This was a crying that someone was just told the worst news possible and their heart was broken. That's the only way I can describe it. The crying stopped eventually and I went about my business. 3 days later at 5:30 in the morning, my father's sister called to tell her their sister Kathleen died. She had leukemia. I forgot to mention, our last name is O'Connor.